Hello, I'm Oriana Fox. Thank you for tuning in to Multiple O's, the spin-off podcast for my talk show, The O Show, which explores the crossover between working on the self and working to change the world. My guests include artists and other experts who expose their lives, bodies, and experiences to challenge expectations and conventions. In other words, they have skin in the game. So if you're interested in candid confessions, nonconformity, creativity, and mental health, you've come to the right place. Hi there, welcome to Multiple O's. This is your host, Oriana. As you know, I'm an artist with a PhD in self-disclosure, and for those of you who listen regularly, you'll know that last week I shared an interview that I carried out for that PhD research back in 2017. That interview was with the artist Chinasa Vivian Ezugha, and we discussed a piece called Because of Hair, which springboarded her career as a live artist in the scene here in the UK and in Europe. And she went on to become co-director of the Live Art Development Agency here in London. And currently, she lives and works in Abu Dhabi, where she's a professor of live art and social practice at NYU. So I had the exciting opportunity to speak with her much more recently, in fact, just last week practically, on the 5th of August, 2024. We spoke again and caught up about how that early work of hers that she was making back in 2017, how that went on to inform subsequent work, and in fact the work that she's doing right now, the project she's doing right now, which include work around food and food scarcity and the use of food as a weapon, which sadly is still resonant today. And yeah, so it's a timely discussion, and I'm excited to share it with you. So without further ado, here is my discussion with Chinasa Vivian Ezugha. Thanks so much for being here, Chinasa, for making the time to do this second interview.
Thank you.
So back in 2017, we kind of ended our discussion with the work you were making at the time around the Biafran Civil War. And I'm wondering if that work used language or how your work developed. And because the works that I know of yours are very much visual, performance-based, action-based works that didn't include language. So I'm just wondering what that work entailed and what you went on to next.
The piece about Biafra was, I think it was 2017, the commission from Rich Mix London. And in the work, I did use language. I was very specific in terms of, writing down my own sort of poetry, reciting collated data in terms of the number of children or people that had died as a result of the Biafran War, and just, kind of reiterating at that point in 2017, the trauma that had been experienced by the Igbo people of Nigeria as a result of British interference and also, this drive for the Nigerian government to ensure that basically they had access to the areas in Nigeria that was heavily densed with oil. So much of what was happening in 2017 was actually very much a response from my part, because this is the Biafran War is part of my history. I'm an Igbo woman, and I identify as a Nigerian, and I identify as a British. And so when I came across the information that I did through my research for this particular work, the Biafran performance, so much of what I was doing in 2017 was an emotional response that was, born out of pain, and pain that was carried through by my grandparents, because they were the ones that existed during that period. They had to witness a lot of tragedies, both from a familiar perspective and from a community perspective. And they never got the chance to tell their stories. So they only really passed some parts of their stories down to us, and to their children. And so I felt really moved. I felt very, very aware of the position that I was in as an Igbo woman, as a Nigerian living in the UK, identifying as a British as well, and knowing that these two nations have contributed to a very, very kind of toxic and traumatic experience for the Igbo people. And when I reflect on it now, of course, the work has come back round in that, you know, while last year in November last year, 2023, I had the opportunity to direct the full production for the theatre program at New York University, Abu Dhabi. And I worked with 3 students who basically over the period of 6 weeks developed a 6-hour performance that was about food as a weapon of warfare, a language, that particular language came out of my research in 2017 when I did the performance at Rich Mix in London. And also the realities of what that research meant to me in 2017 came to the foreground in 2023 with the students. And of course, the students had their own experience with food, both from a food security perspective and also food insecurity. So the work has come back because I'm in the Middle East, I'm in the UAE, I'm asking questions about sustainability, and I'm also, in many ways, thinking through about the things that have occurred in Nigeria in the Biafran War and how that actually relates to what's happening currently in the region. The work has become a bigger research that's not just about sustainability from a selfish standpoint, but actually thinking through about, what is food, both from a very kind of real perspective in that people need food to survive. When people don't have access to food, it does something to them. But then also from a research perspective, how does food become a framework, a methodology for thinking about things like identity, thinking about, politics, thinking about what happens when people are displaced as a result of war? How does food itself, the evolution of food, the production of food, the preparation of food, and the way that we consume food become a framework for thinking about those things? Because I think it's very clear to me in the UAE how that has happened or how it is happening, just because there's so many people from different parts of the world here, and each person brings their own unique way of eating, way of preparing, way of cultivating food. But it has, for me, become even more unprecedented because of what's going on in Gaza. And, when I read the newspaper and I listen to the news, I can't help but to almost like have flashbacks, because I'm reading things that are reminding me of the things that I read about what was going on in Nigeria during that Biafran civil war. And my research showed me that basically that the capacity of human beings to be evil is expansive, and sometimes the most mundane aspect of our living could be used to do extraordinary evil. And somehow food was that thing in Biafra, and it's the thing that's going on, that's been used also now in Gaza.
Yeah. So that's your focus now, or you're in 2023, and is that something you're continuing now?
The work that I'm doing now is not specifically looking at staging a performance, and it's more about really kind of spending time with literature. So I've been writing over the summer. I've been doing a research residency at Asakal Arts Foundation in Dubai. And there I'm looking at food, and I developed a series of texts that is around food thought, but specifically using autoethnographic methods to really think about food.
Mm.
So in this, I'm shifting between the food experience that I've had in the UK, the food experience that I've had in Nigeria, the food experience that I'm having currently in the UAE, and trying to really document through writing what those experiences are. And I want to think about how then to invite others in. And so, working collaboratively from an interdisciplinary perspective, I'm thinking about how artists and entrepreneurs can work together to think about food, think about the relationship that we have as a community with food, but also, through that, think also about how we create a space where activism isn't just something that we write about or talk about, but it actually becomes a way of disseminating, our response to the world that we're living in. And doing that is something that I am very passionate about, and I still trying to understand how that happens, whether that's it as a performance or whether that's as, a series of published texts. These are sort of questions that I'm grappling with, because I'm also not naive to the fact that I'm living in a country where performance art or live art is still very new. It's still something that they are also negotiating with. And so questions about what context and what space would hold this sort of conversation, both from a performative aspect and a research perspective, is also something that I'm grappling with. And so I'm tailoring how I move with the research as a result of the different spaces that I'm in.
That's so interesting. I just feel like I know a lot of live artists or people who are kind of involved in the live art community in London who've kind of gone towards writing, and I wonder how much of that is due to the pandemic. I mean, you're saying it's due to this context shift of being in the UAE, and so yeah. Just do you think that's an element of it, the pandemic, or as well, or
I don't know. I think I've always written as part of my practice, and there's artists like Vest and Page, who are they make performance, but they also write. Andrea publishes quite frequently some of the some of his thoughts around what's going on. I think that the pandemic gave, I guess, artists also space to really reflect and think about how, especially performance artists and live artists, how we disseminate politics and theories. And naturally, I think that writing is a way of doing that. But I would also say that, you know, many artists also write because it's a way of rethinking and reprocessing ideas. I would say that writing has always been closely aligned to my practice, though it hasn't always been easy. And I guess now that I'm in an academic institution, it's become more pivotal in terms of how I communicate my ideas, and also doing a PhD, of course. But I would say that I think for me, it's a shift in context because of the space that I find myself in. Um, but I can also see that for many, especially in the UK, uh, during the pandemic, I think the pandemic did offer a massive, it created a huge gap. And so, in some ways, we were all living with our thoughts and our thought processes. Writing, for many, I'm sure, became a way also of surviving.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I personally feel like I identify as a feminist, and and I identify as you know as deeply invested in, I guess, the politics of identity in intersectional feminism and politics of identity. But I find it really, I don't feel confident as a kind of, as an activist. I don't feel like I can identify myself confidently as an activist, and therefore I don't think I would. I don't know, maybe one day, but I don't feel like I would ever make work about like political history, or like the way that you've gone on to do. And I'm just wondering, did you always have like confidence in your political views, like to come forward and like make a stand and be an activist, or to use your work? I mean, you talked about it in the interview about British culture, and I guess maybe I'm guilty of this complaint culture. Whereas being from Nigeria, and the kind of risk entailed in speaking up, and that people, and that you kind of had a model for a different model for how to be, and the stakes involved in kind of speaking one's mind, and taking a political stand, and that kind of, yeah, much higher stakes, but that kind of propels a different engagement, different level of engagement. So I'm just wondering, yeah, did you always, could you talk a bit about that?
I would say that yes, the UK does have a complaint culture, but I also recognize that things are changing a lot in the UK. You know, as we speak, there's riots occurring in the streets of different parts of the UK, because there's this sort of, you know, on one hand, there's the complaint culture, and then on the other hand, there's the culture of making do and just getting on with things. And then it boils over and then it spills out into extreme violence, as we're seeing. And whether we agree with, you know, the reasons behind the violence or not, we have to understand and also empathize with a community of people who, for the past 14 years, were under a conservative government that in some ways subdued the country and demonized a lot of things. And so in that space, there has been people who have been empowered to feel like they can speak and talk about the things that matter to them. And then there's been others who, regardless of whether we agree with their views or not, have felt that they've not been empowered to voice their opinions. And so what has happened now is that there's a huge vacuum that's been, you know, filled with things that has existed and has been subdued because everybody hasn't had the same equal rights to complain or to talk about what they feel without either being demonized or being accused of being either or. So, and this is to say that I do not agree with the violence. I don't agree with the responses that are occurring as a result of this very tragic event. I think there are better ways to handle these situations, but I also recognize that in the UK, there's very complex ways of communicating, as with Nigeria as well. But I think with Nigeria, you know, even in Nigeria, there is ongoing protests against the, you know, cost of living conditions that people have had to endure for the past how many decades. But now it's gotten to the critical point where people are suffering even more. And people are suffering even more versus also people are also gaining so much more. And people are being killed as a result of them standing up and speaking up against the, you know, government and the situation that is around them. So I would say that, you know, existing between these two different national identities in Nigeria, I think that I grew up knowing that I had to speak, or I had to, in some ways, I learned from a young age that there are ways of existing in a community. And if you want something, you have to fight for what you want. I also learned that in the UK, if in order to maximize how much impact you make, When you speak, you have to know how to articulate yourself and when to articulate yourself. So I think having these two different experiences definitely gave me confidence in being able to talk about, my politics. I don't think that my confidence is all the way there, because I think there are things that I'm still negotiating in my personal life, and in my artistic life, and how this sort of influences how free I feel about speaking about certain things. But I certainly feel like I have been able to grow up in societies where you get pushed to a point where you do have to speak, or you are kind of made aware from a young age that if you don't speak, then you are also saying yes to what you're experiencing. And if you're going to say yes to it, then you have to know that you will have to deal with that and all the repercussions that comes with it.
Do you think that making work making because of hair, or do you see it as a progression of getting more confident to speak your mind, or is that something I'm projecting onto it?
No, you're absolutely right. I do feel that, I went from feeling afraid of seeing how people responded to me by, hiding my face in some ways. And really kind of trying to, navigate this role of being a Black woman, being a certain state stature, embodying this hair thing, dealing with all my personal trauma, and at the same time being very shy, to now being able to say that it's my choice as to whether I conceal or reveal. And I think that I also have a lot to thank the UK for, because I think that the UK educational system, performance art, live art community, and actually the whole of Europe, actually, in terms of, the performance art community, really held me and also challenged me, so that in some ways I learned to be confident. I learned that if I'm going to perform in this way, then I also have to have for myself the strength to be able to defend my reasons for being this way, because people don't always feel like they understand what's going on in a performance. So naturally, what will happen is they will ask lots of questions. And sometimes those questions, you know, can sound racist, or they can sound misogynistic, they can sound, in whichever way. So being able to sort of understand that it's okay for someone to ask the question. It's not okay for someone to be abusive, of course, but I also know that I have to be strong enough to take what comes, whether that's a question, whether that's abuse or whatever. So yes, I do think the hair project certainly gave me a lot of confidence. Um, and that confidence wasn't just solely based on me. It was also confidence that came from seeing, promoters seeing that there's value in the work and saying, we want to showcase this work. That's a huge confidence boost, because even if the audience don't like it or don't believe in you, someone believed enough to say, we'll put this in the festival for spill or for in between time. And, naturally that helps with confidence.
Hmm. Yeah, I so identify with everything you're saying. And yeah, but also that kind of segues nicely into talking about the context of festivals and curators and people supporting you in the UK. One of the questions I had written down, which is to do with you having been the co-director of at Lara, and I was just wondering, yeah, what your kind of approach to when you were there at Live Art Development Agency, or like in that position of power of maybe commissioning others, or working with others in that role as the director. Like how does your ethos come across in that context, or how did it come across in that context?
Well, I would say that the concept of power is something that is in flux. especially if you're a Black woman in what is perceived as a position of power. My time at Lada was very traumatic, and I've not really spoken a lot about my experience, not really openly and not officially, because I think, it takes me a long time to process certain kinds of experiences. And with Lada, it's one of those experiences where, I saw people that I had worked with for years when I was just merely a performer, an artist, turn into the worst kind of human beings I have ever encountered, purely because also, what I realized when I was at Lada was that many people that when I was an artist approached me with this notion of, oh, we want to support your work because you're a Black woman and we recognize that this community is that you're very marginalized in this live art community and we want to support your work. When I came into Lada and took up this role as co-director, those politics that they displayed to me as being something that they truly believed in was actually nothing but a lie. And in some ways, I learned very quickly that when you go from, making work as an artist to taking up a leadership role in an organization like LADA, you can't approach it in the same way that you would approach your politics as an artist, because people see you in a very kind of a different position. I would say that I was probably the most vulnerable in my life while I was at LADA. I was treated the worst. Even when I think about my experience at Spill, and I had people screaming in my face and calling me out, or calling me all kinds of names and whatever, I would say that my experience at Larder was worse than Spill, because everything was not about actually the art. It was more about servicing other people's egos. Artists that I, again, like I said, I'd worked with in the past turned out to be not the people I thought they were. People became very demanding of time, very demanding of space. And even within my position, my perceived position of power, I was still being, abused. I was still dealing with the same issues about race and, gender imbalance. I was still dealing with it all. It was just that now it was magnified because I was in this perceived position of power. And so my responses to those issues had to be different. I couldn't go out and make a performance about the organization that I was working for in the same way that, for example, if I was commissioned by LADA as an artist but was experiencing this, my response would be immediate. It would have more, punch, I would say. I would probably be more aggressive in my response, and I certainly would not have put up with it. But when you're in this perceived position of power as a Black woman, you then become actually a slave, because it wasn't empowering to work for LADA. I was made to feel almost on a daily basis that I was a slave. And that's when I really started to understand what systemic racism is, because I would say that I was very naive to the concept or the notion and the reality of systemic racism, because you can move freely in the UK and you have a space to say whatever you want to say. I know things have changed now, but at the time when I was in the UK and making work as an artist, the freedom of expression truly felt like freedom of expression, because even if someone hated what you were saying, you still had people who wanted you to say what you wanted to say. When you come into a leadership role in a predominantly white organization, in a predominantly white led community, and then you realize, through different interactions and the way people speak to you, the perceived notion of privilege and the ways that, you have to almost like censor yourself in certain situations, it doesn't feel like a space of freedom or a safe space. It feels like slavery. And that's how I felt at Lada. So it was for me, like the first time in my life where I thought, I don't know how to create a safe space in this environment for myself and for those that I work with. I don't know how to create a safe space for Black artists in the UK, because right now I feel like I'm under attack and I don't know how to deal with what's coming to me, because it wasn't something that was every now and again. It was constant. It was from the staff, it was from the board, it was from the community, it was from artists that I, openly invited in and said I wanted to support. It became so intense that in the end, I think for me, I just thought, I have to leave because I have to focus on my priorities, which changed because I had two kids by the time I left Lada. I had started this new job at NYU Abu Dhabi, and I wanted to now give myself, actually, for the first time, the safe space that I, for so long thought I had in the UK. I wanted to give it to myself and say, I need to step away from this space and I need to step back and really kind of observe what I'm watching, which unfortunately for me, or I think unfortunately in general, what I witnessed at Lada was that there had been no growth within the live art sector, both from the equality, diversity standpoint, and certainly from the disability standpoint. There was no, I would never be able to say that, the live art community in the UK is what they say they are, because I saw them for what they are from the inside. And it was scary, actually. It was quite scary.
Sounds terrible. I'm sorry that you had that experience, and I'm kind of shocked by hearing that. I mean, I just, I'm just not. I'm obviously, I'm involved with the Live Art Development Agency, or I was prior to you becoming the director. But then when you were there, I was really not involved with it at all, and I was very much just on the outside and not really knowing any of that. And have you found your new position to be more welcoming, or do you find that that's been a better fit for you?
I mean, I would say that it's a space of growth for me. I never really envisaged that my my career would progress to, me becoming an academic, because it was something that I always shied away from, because I also had to negotiate my own inner insecurities about, my education, my ability to do things or not do things that my peers could or couldn't do. I had to kind of work through the negotiations that were more personal. And when I did, and I say when I did, but I would say that I am still working through some of those negotiations, but with a better clarity and a sense of fulfillment and a sense of confidence in what I'm doing now and where I am. Understanding that the lessons that I learned in the UK as an artist, but also within this leadership role at Lara, has also given me new materials that is so much more rich. However traumatic it was, these materials are rich because it helps me to position uh, myself differently in this space. It also helps me to understand the complexity of existing within the creative sector and to not make the same mistakes that I made in the past. So all in all, I do think it's a safer space for me, because I have learned to create that safe space, and to not just create it for others but specifically for myself as a starting point. And also I think that this is a world where the politics and the the kind of perceived notion of freedom that people have in the UK is different here. So here you have to know why you're saying what you're saying, because when you do speak, it's heard, and when it's heard, people will ask questions. People will, want to clarify. There are repercussions if you're just going to speak for the sake of speaking. You have to know how you move around in this society. And that gives me a greater sense of awareness and a greater sense of understanding to be able to utilize the tools that I have in order to make a difference. So for me, I feel very privileged to be here, and I also feel like this is a very important stage in my life. So I am grateful for it. Yeah.
Could you say more about the nuts and bolts of you mentioned creating safe spaces and you feel like you have an ability to do that now. Could you say more about like exactly how that actually could be realized? So if you could say more about like the specifics, I'm
Sure. I
curious.
mean, I would say that if I think about my experience with the students that made this 6-hour performance, we spent 6 weeks working together. And part of that process was actually about them coming in and resting. And then also in being able to be cared for, they started to reflect back on, well, we feel cared for, but we also would like our audiences to feel cared for. So we become responsible in the things that we are saying. We become responsible in how we utilize material in space. We don't just do things because we think it's for shock value or because it's, going to be perceived as a taboo or something interesting, but we do things because there's an intentionality in what we're doing. And that intentionality is not built on this selfish me culture. It's built on a culture where I have something to say that I think you will find interesting, and I hope that will bring you to respond also and say something. And I'm going to create a safe space where both of us can feel empowered to say what we want to say, and even if you disagree with what I'm saying, it's okay. From my perspective, from a personal perspective, one of the things that I struggled with when I was younger and working in the UK was being able to say no and also being able to let go. I can't even, begin to tell you how many jobs I did while I was, you know, up and coming in my practice that were so destroying. And I subjected myself to environments that were very toxic, spaces where I was being racially abused verbally by not just, people that I was working with, but by publics. And I stayed all in this notion of, oh, I want to make a change. I want to change something. I want to, be somebody who can educate someone or something about why it's not necessary to use these languages or why it's important to have an open mind and to not judge people and to not be racially abusive. Now, I don't do that because it's not my labor. If it's not going to be a safe space for me, if that space is not going to yield what I need it to yield, I leave. I take my peace and I go. I value my own health, my mental health, and my physical health, and I value also in the need to protect my peace. And that peace is not like sometimes people talk about protecting their peace and it can come out very selfish. But when I talk about protecting my peace, I'm talking about how I am able to navigate both the situation presently and also in the future. So when I left LADA, I think I was reaching a point where I quit my job in January of 2023. And then there were some issues that occurred with the Arts Council England, and I took back my resignation to try to bring LADA across the wave, and then by the time I quit again in July, or actually, should I say in May, and subsequently left in July, I had reached a point where I thought, actually, this is enough. There's nothing more I can do here. I'm harming myself, and I need to let go of this space and all this toxic experience so that I don't carry hatred in my heart towards Lada, but also towards the people that did what they did. So I think for me, that's the practicalities of creating a safe space for myself, is knowing now that I can say no, and it's okay to let go, because I really struggled with this for a very long time. And even to the point where when I was doing the performance at Spill, even when the organizers told me, that there's a hostile crowd outside and we don't think it's a good idea for you to perform, I was still willing to do the performance because I thought, this is the way to do this. I thought I'm doing something that is important, and it is important, but I didn't put my safety, I didn't put the care that I needed first. And so I was trying to, yeah, almost like I don't even know the word for it, but I think I was trying to prove a point that didn't need to be proven. And I was thinking that if I could do this performance, and then I could change the narrative that the audience were, the public were sort of going down with, or that I could make a difference, or I could, show like the future artists, especially Black women artists, that you can do this. And really and truthfully, all I was doing was harming myself. But now it's a very different situation. There's certain conversations that I will not entertain. And certainly in terms of when I come into the making space, specifically with students, I'm looking at them as audiences as much as performers, because of the fact that I have a wealth of experience as an artist that have worked in the UK and in Europe. And so that experience that I have brings me to a place where I always enter the space with empathy. And in that empathy, immediately before we start anything, my priority is always first to create a space where everybody in that space values our humanity, our shared humanity, and our individual humanity. And so I never try to push anybody to go beyond what they can take. I try to offer tools, or I should say, I try to offer materials that they can use and go to a place where they feel comfortable. And in doing so, I also try to offer the same perspectives that I have offered them to back to them, but in relation to how they view audience. So, maybe you need to give people space. When you're talking about difficult subjects, maybe you should also think about not being offended immediately if somebody has a very visceral and embodied experience or response to something that they're witnessing. You have empathy for yourself. So also imagine what empathy they would require in being able to at least process what they are experiencing. And of course, in situations where things might get violent, always protect yourself, and take the space you need, and don't be angry with yourself for being angry, basically.
That's interesting. So it's very much about emphasizing one's need to protect oneself or set up boundaries. I feel like that, yeah, that just really aligns with, yeah, just the nature of that kind of risky art making practice. That it can only it can only be done safely if there are boundaries in place. So that, I think, yeah, it just aligns really clearly with the way I've thought of it in the past. But yeah, I was wondering if you could say more about your PhD research.
So actually, my PhD research is about voice. It's sort of looking at a methodology that I have used a lot in my performance, and that's speaking in tongues, so glossolalia. And here I'm looking at glossolalia from an artistic perspective, because previous research on glossolalia, which obviously translates to speaking in tongues, has always positioned it from a linguistics, philosophical, and anthropological perspective. So in my PhD, I'm looking at it as an art form, and looking at it from the perspective of my practice as a performance artist, also as a Christian, and the value or the importance of speaking in tongues in my religious practice, with my sisters, but also by myself. And then looking at it as a sort of a pedagogical tool. So I'm happy to say that I think I'm reaching near to the end of this PhD journey, because it's been a very long journey and it has seen me through so many different milestones in my life. It's never just about the research, it's about the research and how it fits in with your overall life. But I've been very lucky because, my supervisors, Professor Konstantinos Tamaladis, is a leading researcher on voice studies in the UK. And Professor Heike Romes, who I'm not sure if you're familiar with, but she's the professor of performance art. She taught at Aberystwyth University, which was my, first university, and she's now at Exeter. So both of them are my supervisors, and I've been very lucky with who they are, and their practice, their politics, and also just, you know, not being so rigid in how, research is presented. It's been a very rewarding experience thus far. And I am looking forward to completing it, because it's just, after a while, it just becomes all encompassing, as they say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is it so it's, I'm assuming it's practice based, so there's a portfolio of practice and then the written thesis.
Exactly.
Yeah. So this work with glossolalia, is that something you're still making pieces using that, or can you talk a bit about some of those, that portfolio? What does it consist of?
Yeah, so obviously, if I go back to when I first started using speaking in tongues in my performance, it started with the hair project. And then it's now progressed to being more focused on the actual voice. So in 2021, I was lucky enough to get funding from Arts Council England, and I developed a 10-minute audio performance where I worked specifically with a collaborator, a sound designer, to bring together my voice, my sisters' voices as they spoke in tongues and as I spoke in tongues. And I created basically an audio performance from those materials. And then yeah, when was it? I think it was, 2023. I created a film titled The Narrow Path, which is, I think it's a 3-minute film, which sort of brings together different practices, mundane activities that occur when speaking in tongues occur. So in the film, there is clips of me plaiting my hair, there is clapping, and there's like a stained glass window, like a footage of a stained glass window. And I've sort of brought these images together because they're symbolic to my experience of speaking in tongues. They're symbolic to also what I'm trying to convey, which is that, speaking in tongues, glossolalia is a religious, it's a faith, it's a spiritual experience that isn't confined to, a building like a church. Like, for me, like, faith, Christianity is so much more about actually a way of living and a way of encountering the world, and what that means in terms of how my faith influences my way of living with people. My faith influences how I view the world. My faith influences how I navigate tough situations, rather than it being about, denominations. And glossolalia is something that is highly linked to the Pentecostal church and the Pentecostal movement. But actually, speaking in tongues is so much more than a movement. It's a way of edifying self. It's a communication that's directed to God. It's viewed as a spiritual language. And for me, it's also a form of, it's an art, because it's, from what I find interesting about it is the way that the mouth changes its rhythm, the way that speech becomes less about making sense and it becomes more rhythmic, more poetic. And also, it's also the frequencies, the change in frequencies, the change in tone, the change in tempo, the sort of, I don't like to use the word trance like, but it's the sense of moving from one space to another space just through the voice. There's no sort of, you can't mask it, you can't add like sauce to it, as they say, or flavor to it. It's literally just the voice. And that's why I find it so beautiful, because it's the voice going beyond, its everyday capacity and in becoming other. And for me, I find that really interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That's interesting what you're saying about becoming other, because I feel like that relates to back to the masks. I felt like, because the masks were very much in a way about becoming other, and now it's, instead of it being about appearance, it's about sound and voice.
Yeah, I think the mask in many ways, was about the outward appearance and what is seen, and how that translates itself in, the actual physicality of space. The voice is is an embodied tool. The voice doesn't just exist through sound, in that, well, it does exist through sound, but it's not something that you can see like a physical manifestation of. The voice isn't an object. An object might carry a voice, or the sound of a voice, but it's not something that's tangible in the same way as the mask. And that, for me, I find interesting, because it's actually very much hidden. If you think about it, when we look at people and we see each other from a very basic standpoint, if I see you and you see me, you might imagine what my voice might sound like based on the color of my skin, my gender, potentially the perceived, body language, the context. You might envisage what the voice might sound like, but you will never truly know what my voice sounds like until I open my mouth and speak. And sometimes what I find so powerful is when the perceived sound of one's voice contradicts the actual reality. So, if we think about like, okay, let's say if we consider some celebrities, or maybe if we think of news readers, there's always something jarring when you see somebody who your immediate perception is that, okay, you're going to read the news, so you must sound like this or like that, and you must be able to pronounce words in this way, because most of them have gone through specific trainings that also includes voice training in order to be able to sound a certain way. And then when they jar that by sounding like your neighbor, for example, you might be left thinking, what is going on? Like, it's a very jarring experience, and it's an outer body experience, because the voice travels into you, like when I speak and when you speak, your voice is carried through and comes into me and then out of me. So when we hear each other's voices, we're actually entering each other's, domain. So there's a constant feedback. Whereas when we're seeing things, you might see somebody like, if you saw me with the mask on, you will see me, and then what comes out, your response is likely to be either things that you've watched before, things that you've seen, things that you've heard, misogynistic, notions and mindsets that you have collected over the years and never thought would come out because you never thought you might be confronted by an image that reminds you of those things. So then your response will be a response that's articulated through, the seeing. When it comes to the voice, it's the hearing, and then, what that voice does to your body, what it then changes in you. So it's a really embodied space. And I feel like voice is probably more masked than the hair mask because it doesn't appeal to traditional concepts and ideologies of what it should sound like, it should be, or etc. If anything, I think it's probably the most radical because it's always uh, changing somebody's perceptions in some way or another.
That's so interesting because as you were talking, I was thinking about how this is a bit random, but how when I listen to podcasts, I start to picture what the person looks like, or if I read a description of a person, like you start to imagine what they look like based on the description, or and yeah, so it's interesting how a voice can paint a picture of an identity for you in your mind, and then when you see the actual podcaster, you're like, oh, that's completely different from who I was picturing. So with these speaking in tongues, with the film, I'd be curious to see it. So how are you showing these things to audiences? Are they in screenings or online or?
Well, no, the film is not online, and I'm very careful to not share it online because I think for me, I'm also thinking about or negotiating what it means to present my work now. So, but the film has been seen by an audience. It's been seen by an audience here at New York University, Abu Dhabi, and it was an exhibition whereby the space was created in a way where, the film could only be experienced through like a sort of a tunnel, and then the sound was sort of projected all around. So you could see the film only via this sort of cutout in the space, but the sound traveled throughout the space. And then the audio is the only aspect of this project that exists online because I wanted it to be sort of like something that could only be accessed online. Although I think it has been, I'm trying to think because it feels like such a long time ago. I think it was shown at, I think it was one of the Miami satellite art shows. And then I think again last year or the year before at one of the Denver video art uh, festival. So I think it's the audio performance has been seen more widely, or experienced. I say seen, but it has been experienced more widely. The film has not, because that has been sort of my personal choice to not share it out widely.
I just have one more question. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but yeah, there is one final question I do want to ask, and that is about this new project. Or I just wanted to say, as someone who's I finished my PhD in 2018, and I don't know if you have a lot of friends who've done a PhD, but I just remember a lot of my friends had this kind of letdown experience of like you reached the end of this major project, and then it's kind of an anticlimax, and often people get depressed afterwards. And I was like so adamant that I was not going to be depressed because I was just going to feel this great sense of accomplishment and kind of keep that sense of accomplishment going, and just not hold back, and just be so thrilled by it, and not drop down into depression. But then of course COVID-19 happened, so it was like inevitable that I would feel a sense of anticlimax. So I think it's great. All this is leading up to me saying I think it's great that you have this big project. It sounds like you're working on a big project to do with food, and the kind of resonance of your experience with food, or your family's experience in Nigeria around food scarcity, and then and the issues around that, and how that was weaponized in that context, and how that's helping you to reflect on, or giving you insight into what's going on in Gaza, and how this is informing this kind of, sounds like a big project to me when you described it, of like involving other people and being interdisciplinary, and that you're still kind of generating or figuring out what that outcomes of that project will be. I just wanted to say that I think it's great to have a big project like that, or something that's really engaging to move on to when you're finished your PhD, because otherwise you can just, often people do get depressed. So I think that's great, because it took me a while to face big projects again. Like, I just felt like it was hard to get that ball rolling, but it sounds like you've already got balls rolling. So I just think that's really good. I just wanted to say.
Thank you. And I think this is also testament to, being able to leaving LADA and moving over here to the UAE and working for this university, which is very heavily, it's a research university. And the ethos is about looking at how research informs pedagogy and vice versa. So I feel very lucky to be in this space where, my mind, as much as I want to finish the PhD, and I know that it's coming at a time when I will need to, like buckle down and sort of condense my time so that I can get the final bits done. I do appreciate having this space where, I can go into other forms of research. I can support my colleagues, or I can be part of other things and also do my own research without necessarily feeling like everything has to be about the PhD, because I can imagine how that feels. It was one of the reasons I finished my MA during the pandemic and immediately sort of like jumped into the PhD, because I didn't want there to be any space between finishing the MA, feeling this euphoria, and then crashing down, because I know how that is. Obviously, when you make performance, and you work so hard to create a performance, whether it's durational or not, at the end of it, there's that horrible, horrible sense of defeat, because you feel like everything you've done was for this moment and you've done it and it feels great, but then, you go back into reality. So, think that what you've said is actually a really important statement, and a very kind of important advice for everyone. Because I think also, I think because, PhD doesn't necessarily now lead to an academic job, especially in the UK, as we know, with what's going on with universities. So it's even more important now to know sort of what the next plan is, and to sort of start working on that, because it can be really intense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Not just the UK. In the USA is the same. But anyway, I think that's a good note to end on, to end the podcast on. So thank you so much for speaking with me and for taking this time to speak with me again. Really appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
That concludes my discussion with Chinasa Vivian Ezugha. Well, actually, my second discussion with her. If you didn't hear the first one, you should check it out. Go back one episode and check that out. I think it's really fascinating to hear the stories of an artist's progression. I hope you agree. It's particularly interesting with someone like her, whose early work was so physically risky, and the ways in which she's developed self-protective boundaries for herself and how she's now teaching that to others. So this discussion of self-protection really follows on nicely and will carry over to the next episode of Multiple O's, in which I interview another key figure from the live art scene here in the UK. I'm talking about Nando Messias, who previously appeared on an episode of The O Show called Without Sacrificing Her Femininity. Their work straddles performance art, dance, and theater, and combines beautiful imagery with a fierce critique of gender, visibility, and violence. It is truly striking and powerful work, so I'm very excited to share my second interview with Nando Messias with you. That's something to look forward to next time on Multiple O's.
Next time on Multiple O's.
In the meantime, I hope you will accept yourself, your lives, and other people unconditionally, because we're all just fallible human beings. Bye-bye.